Noah first noticed it on a Tuesday morning in October, though the day itself meant nothing because it felt like all the other mornings that came before it. A series of identical moments stacked on top of each other like transparent sheets of glass, each one showing the same image until you couldn't tell where one ended and another began. He woke up in his apartment, the same apartment he had lived in for 3 years, the same small space with its cream-colored walls and cheap laminate flooring and furniture he had bought from discount stores because none of it really mattered, because it was all just temporary, just a place to exist between the hours when he had to be at work and the hours when he could sleep. He lay there for a moment staring at the ceiling fan that never moved because he never turned it on, and something felt different in a way he couldn't name, couldn't articulate even to himself. Not wrong exactly, just thinner somehow, as if the world around him had been diluted while he slept, like someone had taken reality and mixed it with water until it became translucent, until you could almost see through it to something else underneath. The sunlight coming through the window seemed less substantial than light should be, more like the memory of light than light itself, more like a photograph of morning rather than actual morning. And when he reached out to touch the nightstand next to his bed, the wood felt somehow approximate, somehow less solid than wood was supposed to feel. He got out of bed and went through his morning routine, the series of small actions he performed every single day without thinking about them, without being present for them, just moving his body through space and patterns it had memorized years ago. Brushing his teeth while staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror without really seeing himself, without recognizing the face looking back as his own face, just seeing a face, some face that could have belonged to anyone. Making coffee in the small kitchen with the chipped white tiles and the microwave that hummed too loudly and the refrigerator that had a broken shelf he kept meaning to fix but never did. Checking his phone for messages even though he knew there wouldn't be any messages because there was never anyone who needed to reach him. Never anyone who would notice if he didn't respond. All the small rituals that people do to convince themselves they exist, to prove to themselves that they are real and present and part of the world. And the whole time there was this sense that he was moving through a space that didn't quite have depth, didn't quite have dimension, like walking through a photograph of a room rather than an actual room, like being an actor in a play he didn't remember auditioning for. He tried to shake the feeling off because there was work to do and bills to pay and all the machinery of life that keeps grinding forward whether you feel real or not, whether you feel present or not, whether you feel like any of it matters or not. He got dressed in clothes that all looked the same, gray pants and a white shirt and a tie that had no personality, no character, just the uniform of someone who works in an office doing things that don't leave any mark on the world. He drove to work on roads he had driven 1,000 times before. Roads that all looked identical, strip malls and gas stations and fast food restaurants repeating in an endless loop like someone had copied and pasted the same mile over and over again. He sat at his desk in a cubicle that was exactly like every other cubicle in the office, under fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly sick, slightly unreal, and he opened his computer and looked at his emails and tried to remember what project he was supposed to be working on, what task he was supposed to complete, and it all felt distant and meaningless, like he was reading about someone else's job, someone else's responsibilities. But the feeling stayed with him all day, that sense of thinness, that sense of being in a world that wasn't quite solid, wasn't quite complete. His coworkers walked past his desk and spoke to him, and he responded with words that seemed appropriate but felt hollow. Felt like he was reading lines from a script someone had written for him. They talked about their weekends and their families and their plans for the upcoming holidays, and their words washed over him without meaning anything, without connecting to anything inside him, just noise shaped like language. At lunch, he sat in the break room eating food that had no taste, no texture, just the vague sense of putting something in his mouth and chewing and swallowing because that was what bodies needed to function, what they required to continue moving through space and time. He watched the other people in the break room laughing and talking and living their lives, and they seemed so distant from him, so separate, like they existed in a different dimension that he could see but not touch, could observe but not participate in. That night when he went to sleep, something changed in a way that he would spend the next year trying to understand, trying to make sense of, trying to reconcile with everything he thought he knew about consciousness and reality and what it meant to be alive. He dreamed he was in a house he had never seen before, a large house with high ceilings and wooden floors that creaked when he walked, and in the dream he knew exactly where everything was, knew the layout without having to think about it, knew that the kitchen had blue tiles and copper fixtures and a window that looked out over the backyard, knew that the bedroom upstairs had a slanted ceiling and a window seat where you could sit and read in the afternoon when the light was good, knew that there was a garden out back with roses and herbs and vegetables growing in neat rows. In the dream he knew this place completely, Knew it the way you know your childhood home, knew it in his bones, in his muscle memory, in the deep familiar way of having lived somewhere for years. And in the dream there was a woman whose name was Claire, and when he saw her he felt a shock of recognition so strong it almost woke him up. A feeling of knowing that was so complete and so immediate that it bypassed his conscious mind entirely and went straight to something deeper, something more fundamental. He knew her completely, knew the way she laughed when something was truly funny versus the polite laugh she used in social situations, knew the small scar on her left hand from when she had cut herself opening a can years ago, knew how she liked her coffee with too much sugar and never enough cream, knew the way she hummed when she was cooking and the way she bit her lower lip when she was concentrating on something, knew her in the way you can only know someone after years and years of living with them, of building a life together, of accumulating thousands of small moments that add up to intimacy. They talked about their day like people do who have shared thousands of days. The easy, comfortable talk of two people who have built a life together, who don't need to explain themselves or perform for each other, who can just exist in each other's presence without effort or pretense. She mentioned that the roses in the garden needed pruning and he said he would do it on Saturday, and the conversation had weight to it, had consequence, was part of a larger ongoing narrative of shared responsibility and mutual care. She asked about his day at work and he told her about a problem one of his students was having, told her about the essay that had shown real insight and growth, and she listened and asked questions and understood, and the understanding felt real, felt solid, felt like it mattered. They made dinner together in the kitchen with the blue tiles, moving around each other with the practiced ease of long familiarity, and they ate and cleaned up and sat on the couch watching a movie they had both seen before, and the whole evening had a quality of realness that his waking life had never had, a sense of being grounded in something solid and true and meaningful. When he woke up the next morning, the woman's face was still clear in his mind, clearer than the faces of people he worked with every day, clearer than his own face in the mirror, and he could still feel the texture of the dream house, the solid reality of it, could still smell the herbs from the garden and hear the creak of the wooden floors and feel the weight of Claire's hand in his hand. And by contrast his apartment felt even thinner than it had the day before, felt even more like a stage set or a simulation, something approximate rather than actual, something that was trying to be a place but not quite succeeding. He sat on the edge of his bed for a long time just trying to hold on to the dream, trying to keep it from fading the way dreams usually fade. But this one didn't fade. It stayed sharp and clear and present in his mind all through the morning, all through his shower and his coffee and his drive to work. He went to work and sat at his desk and answered emails and attended meetings where people talked about quarterly projections and market share and customer engagement metrics and all the abstract concepts that businesses use to justify their existence, to convince themselves that what they do matters, that their work has meaning and value and impact. And none of it felt connected to anything real. None of it felt like it mattered in any genuine way. The people around him seemed to be performing their roles rather than living them, going through motions they had memorized but didn't understand, saying words that had been said a million times before in a million other meetings in a million other offices, words that meant nothing and changed nothing and affected nothing. And he found himself thinking about Claire even though he had never met anyone named Claire in his waking life, had never been to a house with blue kitchen tiles, had never had a garden with roses and herbs, had never taught students who wrote essays about anything. But the memory of it sat in his chest like something solid and true, more solid than the memory of what he had done the day before or the week before or the month before. And he realized with a creeping unease that he couldn't quite remember what he had done the week before. Not in any specific way, not in any detailed way, just a vague sense that he had gone to work and gone home and slept and repeated the cycle. But there were no details, no specific moments, no particular conversations or events that stood out from the general blur of time passing. He tried to remember what he had done last weekend and came up with nothing. Just a blank space where memories should be. Just a sense that time had passed but nothing had happened during that time. No experiences had occurred. No moments had been lived. He tried to remember what he had eaten for dinner yesterday and couldn't. Tried to remember what project he had worked on last week and couldn't. Tried to remember any specific thing about any specific day in the past month and found that it was all just a formless gray mass of repetition, all the same, all meaningless, all forgettable because there was nothing to remember, no actual living had taken place, just existing, just time passing through him rather than him passing through time. That night he dreamed of the house again, and this time he was in the garden, his hands in the soil, and the earth was cool and damp and real, more real than anything in his waking life. More real than his desk at work or his apartment or his car or anything he touched during the hours when he was supposed to be awake and present. He could feel every grain of dirt, could feel the texture of it, could feel the life in it, the way it gave and compressed under his fingers, the way it stuck to his skin. He was planting something, bulbs for next spring, and he knew exactly how deep to plant them and how far apart they should be. Knew it without thinking about it because it was knowledge that lived in his body, in his hands, knowledge that came from years of doing the same task in the same garden. And Claire came out and brought him water in a glass that was cold and perfect, with condensation running down the sides, and when he drank it he could taste it, really taste it, could feel the coldness of it going down his throat, could feel his body accepting it and using it and being grateful for it. They talked about their plans for the weekend, and she wanted to visit her sister who lived 2 hours away in a small town near the coast. And he said that sounded good, that it had been too long since they had seen her. And then Claire mentioned that her sister was worried about her husband who had been acting strange lately, distant and distracted, not quite present even when he was physically there, and the conversation felt important in a way conversations usually didn't. Felt like it mattered because it was part of a network of relationships and histories and ongoing stories, because these were real people with real lives and real problems, not just background characters in his personal narrative, but actual human beings with their own interiority and complexity. He asked what kind of strange, and Claire said just disconnected, like he was somewhere else, like his mind was somewhere his body wasn't, and Noah felt a small, uncomfortable recognition in that description but pushed it away and focused on the feel of the soil and the smell of the roses and the solid, unquestionable reality of where he was. He could feel the sun on his neck, could feel the specific quality of afternoon light in late summer, warm but not hot, gentle rather than harsh, and he could smell the roses blooming nearby, could identify the different varieties by their scent, knew that the pink ones smelled different from the red ones, knew which ones Claire liked best and why. And when he woke up he was disoriented for several seconds, actually disoriented, unsure which world was the dream and which was the reality, and then he saw his apartment ceiling and felt a wave of something like grief, a loss so profound it made him stay in bed for an extra 20 minutes just lying there wishing he could go back, wishing he could return to the place that felt like home, to the life that felt like living rather than just existing. The pattern continued for weeks, and each night the dream life became more detailed and complete, more layered and textured and real. There was a job in the dream where he taught history at a community college, taught it to students who were mostly adults returning to school, people who had lived full lives and were coming back to education later, people who had stories and perspectives and real engagement with the material. He knew all his students' names and their struggles and their potential, knew them as individuals rather than faces in a crowd, knew that Marcus was working 2 jobs to support his family while getting his degree, knew that Linda had come back to school after her divorce to rebuild her life, knew that James was struggling with depression but was showing up anyway, doing the work anyway, fighting for his future anyway. He had conversations with them that mattered, conversations about history not as a series of dates and facts but as a story about human choices and consequences, about how we got to where we are and where we might go from here, and the students listened and engaged and cared because they could tell that he cared, that this mattered to him, that he believed teaching was important work that shaped minds and changed lives. And there were friends in the dream who had known him for years, who referenced things they had done together in the past, inside jokes and shared experiences that felt absolutely real when he remembered them, felt more real than the people in his waking life who he saw every day but barely knew, barely connected with beyond the superficial exchanges that passed for human interaction in the modern world. There was Michael, who he had known since college, who had been his roommate for 2 years and who knew him in that deep way that only comes from living with someone during formative years, from seeing them at their best and their worst and accepting them anyway. They had lunch together every Thursday and talked about philosophy and politics and life, had deep conversations about meaning and purpose and how to live well, and those conversations felt substantive and important, felt like they were building something rather than just killing time. There was Sarah, who worked at the college in the English department and who he had coffee with most mornings before class, who was funny and smart and saw the world in interesting ways that challenged his perspectives and made him think differently. There was David and his wife Rebecca, who they had dinner with once a month, who were navigating the complexities of raising 2 young children and maintaining their relationship and building careers, who they could talk to honestly about the difficulties of adult life, about money and family and aging parents and all the things that people actually worry about when they're being real with each other. In the dreams he had a past that made sense, that had continuity and causation, one thing leading logically and meaningfully to another. He had childhood memories of a different family than his actual family, memories of a mother who had died when he was 12 and a father who had raised him alone and done his best even though it was never quite enough, even though they were both grieving and lost and trying to find their way. He remembered the specific grief of that loss, remembered the funeral and the months after when nothing felt real, remembered slowly learning to live with the absence, learning that grief doesn't go away but you learn to carry it, you learn to make space for it in your life. He remembered how it had shaped him, had made him more empathetic, more aware of other people's pain, more careful with others because he knew how fragile everything really was. It was a complete life with continuity and causation, one thing leading to another in a way that created meaning, created a coherent narrative, created a sense of identity that was built from experiences and relationships and choices. And every morning when he woke up to his apartment and his job and his life, that life felt increasingly like a mistake, like he had taken a wrong turn somewhere and ended up in this thin, hollow version of existence while his real life continued without him somewhere else, while the person he was supposed to be went on living the life he was supposed to be living, and he was stuck here in this simulation, this approximation, this wrong version of reality. He started to dread waking up, started to feel a sinking despair every morning when he opened his eyes and saw the apartment ceiling, when he realized he was back in the wrong place, trapped in the wrong life for another day. He started to notice that when he tried to remember his waking life, the memories were strange and slippery, insubstantial in a way that memories shouldn't be. He could remember that he went to work but couldn't remember the drive there or the drive home, couldn't remember what route he took or what he saw along the way or whether he listened to music or the radio or just drove in silence. He couldn't remember what he ate for lunch or what emails he sent or what meetings he attended, couldn't remember any specific conversation or interaction with any specific person. The days blurred together into a meaningless repetition, each one identical to the last, and when he tried to recall specific events, specific moments, they weren't there, just a vague sense that time was passing but nothing was happening, that he was moving through space but not actually going anywhere, that his life was just a series of blank spaces with no content, no substance, no reality. But the dream life, the life with Claire and the house and the teaching job and the friends, that life he could remember in perfect detail, could remember with a clarity and specificity that made it feel more real than any memory from his waking life. He remembered the first time he had met Claire in that world, at a coffee shop near campus where she had been reading a book and had spilled her drink when someone bumped into her table, and he had been at the next table and had helped her clean it up with napkins, and they had started talking and discovered they both loved old movies from the 1940s and terrible puns that made other people groan. They had talked for 3 hours that first day, had talked until the coffee shop was closing and the staff was cleaning up around them and they had to leave, and they had exchanged numbers and gone on a first date 2 days later, and the connection had been immediate and obvious and real. He remembered their third date when they had driven to the coast and walked along the beach at sunset and talked about their families and their pasts and their fears, had opened up to each other in the way you do when you meet someone and recognize that this might be important, that this might be something. He remembered the first time they had said "I love you," 6 months after they started dating, on a night when they were cooking dinner together and she was chopping vegetables and he was stirring sauce and he had just looked at her and felt overwhelmed with the reality of her, with how much she meant to him, and the words had just come out without planning or rehearsal, just the truth spoken simply and clearly, and she had stopped chopping and looked at him and said it back, and they had both cried a little because it was real and it was right and they both knew it. He remembered proposing to her 2 years later on a beach during a sunset that turned the sky orange and pink and purple. Remembered the exact words he had said and the way his voice had shaken because he was nervous even though he knew she would say yes. Remembered the way she had cried when she said yes, happy tears that he had wiped away with his thumbs while holding her face in his hands. He remembered the wedding 6 months after that, small and simple with just close friends and family. Remembered his father's speech where he had talked about Noah's mother and how proud she would have been. Remembered Claire's sister reading a poem about love that had made everyone cry. He remembered the honeymoon in Italy, 2 weeks of wandering through old cities and eating too much pasta and making love in hotel rooms with the windows open, learning each other's bodies and rhythms and preferences in the way newlyweds do. He remembered buying the house 3 years ago, remembered the excitement of finding it, of walking through and imagining their life there, imagining where they would put their furniture and what they would do with the garden and how they would make it theirs. He remembered the work they had done together, painting the bedroom and arguing about what color to paint the kitchen and finally agreeing on blue because it made the room feel calm and peaceful and right. He remembered planting the garden that first spring, neither of them really knowing what they were doing but learning together, making mistakes and adjusting and trying again, and the satisfaction of seeing things grow, seeing their effort turn into something beautiful and alive. These memories were solid and fixed and true, had the weight and texture of real memories, had the emotional resonance that comes from actual lived experience. They stretched back years, an entire alternate history that felt more authentic than his actual history. more meaningful than anything that had happened to him in his waking life. And he began to realize that maybe it was his actual history. Maybe this was who he really was, and the person named Noah who worked in an office and lived alone in an apartment was the mistake, was the dream, was the thin hollow simulation that he needed to wake up from. One morning in November he woke up and couldn't remember his mother's face. His real mother from his waking life. The woman who had given birth to him and raised him, and who was still alive somewhere living her own life that didn't include him very much anymore because they had drifted apart over the years the way families sometimes do. He lay in bed trying to picture her, and all he could see was the mother from his dreams, the one who had died when he was 12, and he knew that was wrong, knew with some distant part of his mind that he had a different mother who was still alive, who he had seen at some point in the recent past, though he couldn't quite remember when. He got up and looked through his phone for photos and found pictures of a woman who looked vaguely familiar but felt like a stranger. Someone he might have met a few times at social occasions but didn't really know, didn't have any real connection to. And there was a sick terror in that moment of realizing he was losing pieces of his waking self, losing the connections that tethered him to this version of reality, losing the markers of identity that defined who Noah was supposed to be. He called the number labeled Mom in his phone, and when she answered and said hello, her voice meant nothing to him, was just sounds arranged in patterns without emotional resonance, without any of the warmth or recognition that a mother's voice should trigger in a son's brain. He made some excuse about calling by accident, said he had meant to dial someone else, and hung up and sat on the edge of his bed feeling like he was disappearing, feeling like Noah was fading away and someone else was taking his place, someone who belonged to a different life in a different world. At work he started making mistakes, simple mistakes that he would never have made before, mistakes that suggested he wasn't really present, wasn't really paying attention, wasn't really there. He forgot meetings and showed up late to ones he did remember, sat through them without understanding what was being discussed, without being able to follow the thread of conversation or contribute anything meaningful. He sent emails to the wrong people with the wrong attachments, confused projects and deadlines, lost track of what he was supposed to be working on and what he had already finished. His boss called him into her office and asked if everything was okay at home, if there was something going on that was affecting his work, if he needed to take some time off to deal with whatever was happening. And he said yes, even though he wasn't sure what home meant anymore, whether it was the apartment where he woke up or the house where he lived with Claire, whether home was this world or the other one, whether he belonged here or there. His boss looked concerned and told him to take a few days off if he needed to get some rest, to take care of himself, and he agreed and left and went back to his apartment and sat on the couch and waited for night to come so he could go back to the real world. The world that felt like home, the world where he mattered and had purpose and was loved. In December the dreams expanded further, became even more detailed and complex and real, and he started to notice something that made his chest tight with a fear he couldn't quite name, couldn't quite articulate even to himself. The people in his dreams remembered things that he hadn't dreamed yet, remembered events and conversations that were new to him but old to them, remembered a shared history that was complete and consistent and ongoing. Claire would mention a conversation they had last month about possibly moving to a bigger house, about whether they needed more space, and he would have a clear memory of that conversation even though he knew, in some distant analytical part of his mind, that he had never dreamed it before, that it was appearing in his memory fully formed in the moment she mentioned it, but it felt real, felt like a genuine memory of something that had actually happened. His students would reference papers they had written for him weeks ago, papers he could remember reading and grading in detail, could remember the specific arguments they had made and the feedback he had given and the conversations they had had about how to improve, but he knew he had never dreamed those papers, had never dreamed those conversations, yet the memories were there anyway, solid and complete and real. Michael would talk about the camping trip they had gone on in the summer, and Noah could remember that trip perfectly, remember the tent and the lake and the trees and the night they had stayed up late talking about their fears and hopes and regrets, remember the quality of the moonlight on the water and the sound of the wind in the trees and the feel of the cool night air on his skin. Remember it with the kind of detailed sensory clarity that only comes from lived experience, from actually being present in a moment and experiencing it fully. It was as if the dream world had a past that existed independent of his presence in it, as if that life continued when he wasn't there, filling in the days he spent awake with events and conversations and moments that became part of his history the next time he fell asleep, creating a complete continuous timeline that had gaps where he was missing but that filled those gaps in automatically, seamlessly, so that when he returned everything was caught up and ready for him to step back into. The world wasn't waiting for him frozen in time, wasn't pausing while he was away, it was moving forward without him, continuing its existence whether he was present or not, which meant it was real. It had to be real, because dreams don't have that kind of independence. Dreams don't continue without the dreamer. Dreams need consciousness to exist, and this world clearly didn't need his consciousness. It existed on its own terms, with its own logic and its own continuity. The realization came slowly over many nights, so slowly that by the time he understood it fully, it felt like he had always known. Felt like a truth that had been there all along, waiting for him to notice it. He wasn't visiting the dreams, wasn't creating them from his imagination or his subconscious or his desires. He was waking up into them, returning to a life that continued in his absence. A life where people waited for him and missed him when he was gone, where his presence mattered and his absence left a gap. Each night when he fell asleep, he wasn't escaping into fantasy. He was coming home. He was waking up to his real life after spending the day trapped in a strange, disconnected dream where nothing felt real and nothing mattered and nothing connected. In one dream, Claire told him she was worried about him, said he seemed distant sometimes, like he wasn't quite there, like part of him was somewhere else, and he realized with a shock that she was talking about the times when he was awake, the 8 or 9 hours each day when he left her and their life together to be someone else in a different world, when he abandoned her without explanation or warning, just vanished from her life for hours at a time. She asked if everything was okay, if there was something he wasn't telling her, something he was struggling with, and he didn't know how to explain that he lived 2 lives, that every morning he abandoned her to spend his day in a hollow simulation where nothing mattered and nothing meant anything, where he was trapped in a body that didn't feel like his and a life that didn't feel like his in a world that didn't feel real. He wanted to tell her but couldn't find the words, couldn't figure out how to explain something that made no sense, that violated every assumption about how consciousness and reality worked. So he just held her and told her everything was fine, told her he loved her and she had nothing to worry about, and she believed him because she trusted him, because they had built a life together based on trust and honesty and mutual care. And he felt guilty for lying to her, but he didn't know what else to do. Didn't know how to tell her the truth without sounding insane, without making her worry even more, without risking everything they had built together. In January, he started to notice that less of him was coming back each morning, that each time he woke up in the apartment he felt more faded, more distant, more disconnected from the person who was supposed to be Noah. He would wake up and feel like he had left something behind, some essential piece of himself that remained in the dream, that stayed with Claire and couldn't make the transition back to this other world. And the longer the day went on, the more he faded, like he was spreading himself too thin between 2 worlds and there wasn't enough of him to fully exist in both, like he was being diluted, dissolved, distributed across 2 different versions of reality until he was barely present in either. At work, he felt like a ghost, like a transparent overlay on top of the real world that people could see through if they looked carefully enough. He moved through spaces that didn't register his presence, talked to people who looked through him rather than at him, sent emails that went unanswered, attended meetings where no one acknowledged his contributions or even seemed to notice he was there. His reflection in mirrors seemed strange and unfamiliar, like he was looking at someone else's face, someone he used to know but couldn't quite place, and sometimes he would look down at his hands and not recognize them, would see them as alien objects attached to his body, would feel disconnected from his own physical form in a fundamental way that made him question whether the body was really his at all or just something he was borrowing temporarily. The only time he felt solid, felt real, felt present and whole and complete was at night when he closed his eyes and returned to Claire and the house and the life that made sense, the life where he belonged, the life where he was wanted and needed and loved. That was when he felt like himself, like James, which was his name in that world, his real name, the name that fit him properly, unlike Noah, which felt like a costume he was wearing, a role he was playing badly. One night in February, Claire told him she was pregnant, told him with tears in her eyes and a smile on her face and her hand on her stomach, and the joy he felt was so complete and overwhelming that it actually woke him up, pulled him out of the dream with the force of the emotion, woke him up crying in his apartment at 3 in the morning. And the grief of being torn away from that moment was so intense he couldn't breathe, couldn't process it, couldn't handle the violence of being ripped out of the most important moment of his life to find himself alone in a dark apartment with nothing but the memory of Claire's face and her words still echoing in his ears. He lay in the dark trying to force himself back to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. His body and mind were too activated, too full of emotion to settle down, and he spent the rest of the night thinking about the child he would have in that other world, the child who would grow up with him as a father, who he would raise and teach and love, who would be his legacy and his contribution to the future. And the thought made him feel more grounded and purposeful than anything in his waking life had ever made him feel. Made him feel like he finally had something worth living for, worth fighting for, worth choosing. When morning came and he had to get up and go to work, it felt like a violation, like an assault on everything that mattered to him, like he was being forced to abandon his real family to perform meaningless tasks in a world that didn't want him. He went through the day in a haze of resentment and longing, counting the hours until he could go back to Claire, could touch her face and put his hand on her stomach and feel the reality of the life growing there, could participate in the beginning of something that would change everything, that would create a new person who would be part of him and part of her and entirely themselves. That night, when he fell asleep, the dream picked up where it had left off, as it always did, with Claire in bed beside him and him putting his hand on her stomach even though it was too early to feel anything yet. And they talked about names and what kind of parents they wanted to be and whether they should find out the gender or wait to be surprised and all the hopes and fears that come with knowing you're about to bring new life into the world. They talked about how their lives would change, about the sleep deprivation and the financial pressure and the complete reorganization of priorities that becoming parents would require. And Claire said she was scared but also excited, said she couldn't imagine a better person to do this with, and Noah felt a love so intense it was almost painful, a commitment so total it went beyond any choice he had ever made. The conversation lasted hours in dream time, deep and meaningful and full of the kind of intimacy that comes from truly knowing someone and being truly known by them, from seeing all of each other and accepting all of each other and choosing each other anyway. And when he woke up the next morning, he realized he had been asleep for almost 12 hours, had slept through his alarm and missed work, and he didn't care at all, would have slept longer if his body had let him. He called in sick and went back to sleep and found Claire again and felt relief so profound it was almost religious, like he had been forgiven for some unnameable sin, like he had been granted permission to be where he wanted to be, to live the life he was meant to live. Over the next few weeks, he started sleeping more and more, going to bed earlier each night, waking up later each morning, and sometimes not waking up at all during the day, just drifting in and out of dreams that were really memories of his real life, the life he was supposed to be living. Work called and left messages he didn't return, and eventually they stopped calling and he assumed he had been fired, but it didn't matter because jobs in that world were just pretend anyway, were just activities to fill time between sleeping, between the hours when he got to be real. Bills piled up unopened on his counter because money felt like an abstraction from a world that didn't matter, a world where nothing had weight or consequence, where everything was temporary and meaningless. His apartment slowly filled with trash he didn't bother taking out, dishes he didn't wash, mail he didn't open, the physical manifestations of his complete withdrawal from participation in the waking world. He ate when he remembered to eat, usually just whatever required the least effort, crackers from a box or peanut butter from a jar, whatever would keep the body functioning enough to carry him from sleep to sleep, because taking care of the waking body felt like maintaining a vehicle he no longer needed, something that existed only to house his consciousness during the hours when he was separated from his real life. In March, he started to notice that the waking world was changing, or maybe it was his perception of it that was changing. He couldn't tell which, and it didn't really matter because the effect was the same. Colors were fading, becoming muted and gray, losing their vibrancy and specificity until everything looked like it was covered in a fine layer of ash. Sounds were becoming distant and unclear, like he was hearing them from underwater or from very far away, muffled and distorted and wrong. The textures of things felt less distinct, less specific, and sometimes when he touched objects they didn't feel like anything at all, just vague resistance against his hand with no temperature or quality to distinguish one surface from another, like touching things through thick gloves that removed all sensation. People's faces began to blur and merge, becoming generic and interchangeable, losing their individual characteristics until he couldn't tell one person from another anymore, couldn't recognize anyone or remember anyone's name or distinguish between the various people he encountered during his waking hours. Their voices all sounded the same, just noise without meaning, words without content, language that had lost its ability to communicate anything. The whole waking world was losing definition, becoming vaguer and more dreamlike ironically, becoming less solid and less real, while the dream world was becoming sharper and more solid, more concrete and more detailed and more real than real. One day in early April, he woke up and couldn't remember his own name, at least not at first, not immediately. He lay in bed trying to recall what he was called in this world, and it took several minutes before the name Noah surfaced from wherever names are stored in the brain, and even then it felt wrong, felt like a name someone had assigned to him arbitrarily rather than a name that belonged to him, a name that fit who he actually was. In the dream he had a different name, James, and that name felt right in a way Noah never had. Felt like it fit him the way a name should fit the person who carries it. Felt like his true name, his real identity. He wondered if he had ever really been Noah, or if Noah was just a role he had been playing for some unclear purpose, a character he had inhabited temporarily for reasons he could no longer remember or understand. Maybe Noah had never been real, maybe Noah was just a mask, a persona, a temporary identity he had tried on and gotten stuck in, and now he was finally figuring out how to take it off, how to shed it and return to being James, to being who he really was underneath. Claire's pregnancy progressed in dream time according to some logic that didn't match waking time, moved faster or slower depending on rhythms he didn't understand but that felt natural and right within that world. By May she was showing, had that particular quality of beauty that pregnant women sometimes have, glowing and full and preparing for something transformative. They were setting up the nursery together, painting the walls a soft yellow because they had decided not to find out the gender and wanted something neutral, something peaceful and welcoming. They assembled furniture together, him reading instructions while she handed him pieces, arguing about whether the directions made any sense and laughing at how bad they both were at this kind of practical task. But doing it together and enjoying the process of building something for their child. They talked constantly about the life they would have as a family of 3, about what kind of traditions they wanted to establish, what values they wanted to instill, what kind of home they wanted to create. They talked about their fears, about whether they would be good enough parents, whether they would make terrible mistakes, whether they would damage their child irreparably despite their best intentions. And Claire said that everyone feels that way, that the fact that they were worried about it meant they would probably be fine, meant they cared enough to try their best, which was all anyone could really do. The reality of it was so solid he could taste it, could feel the weight of responsibility and purpose that came with it, could feel himself changing already in preparation for fatherhood, becoming more careful, more thoughtful, more aware of consequences and future impacts. And in contrast, the waking world became increasingly meaningless, increasingly irrelevant. What was the point of paying bills in a world that wasn't real? What was the point of maintaining relationships with people who weren't really people, just shadows, approximations, placeholders in a simulation that existed only to keep him occupied during the hours when he was separated from his true life? What was the point of any of it when his real life, his real family, his real purpose was somewhere else waiting for him? He stopped leaving his apartment entirely sometime in June, just stopped seeing any reason to leave because there was nothing out there he needed, nothing that couldn't wait until he had finished living his real life. Every minute spent awake felt like time stolen from Claire and the baby, felt like time he should be spending with them instead, felt like an injustice he was committing against the people who actually mattered to him. He slept 18 hours a day at first, then 20, waking only long enough to use the bathroom and eat something and drink water before returning to bed, returning to the world that mattered, returning to the life worth living. In that world, the baby was born in late June on a warm evening, just as the sun was setting, born healthy and perfect with tiny fingers and a surprisingly loud cry. They named her Emma after Claire's grandmother who had died the year before, and when Noah held her for the first time in the hospital room with Claire exhausted but radiant in the bed behind him, he felt a completeness he had never felt before, felt like all the scattered pieces of himself had finally come together into something coherent and meaningful and true. He felt terrified and overwhelmed and more alive than he had ever been, felt present in his body and his moment in a way he had never experienced in the waking world, felt like he was finally real. He fed Emma and changed her diapers and walked her around the house at night when she cried, learning her different cries and what they meant, learning her rhythms and preferences, learning how to comfort her and soothe her. He and Claire navigated the exhaustion of new parenthood together, taking turns with night feedings, supporting each other through the difficult moments, celebrating each small milestone, each tiny indication of development and growth. And every moment was exactly as difficult and exactly as perfect as it should be, was real in the way that real things are real, with all the mess and joy and exhaustion and love that comes with being alive, with being responsible for another life, with being part of something bigger than yourself. In July, he realized with a start that he was no longer sure which world he was in when he woke up, that the boundary between waking and dreaming had become so blurred that he couldn't reliably tell them apart anymore. Sometimes he would open his eyes and see the apartment's ceiling and think he was in the bedroom upstairs at the house, would take several seconds to remember that this was the other place, the wrong place, the place he was trying to escape from, and feel disoriented and wrong and displaced until he could fall back asleep and return to where he belonged. Other times he would wake up in the dream and for a moment think he was in the apartment and feel a flash of panic before he saw Claire sleeping next to him or heard Emma making noise in her crib and remembered where he really was, where he was supposed to be. The two worlds were bleeding together in his mind, losing their distinction, merging in ways that made it hard to remember which life was which memories belonged to which version of reality. He had to concentrate to remember that the apartment was the dream and the house was real, had to remind himself consciously and deliberately that Noah was the false identity and James was the true one, even though it should have been obvious, even though it should have been simple to tell the difference between the hollow simulation and the solid reality. His body in the waking world was deteriorating. He could feel it happening, could feel himself becoming weaker and thinner and more fragile. But it didn't matter because that body was just a shell, just the thing he was trapped in during the hours when he was exiled from his real body, his real life. It didn't need to be healthy or strong or well-maintained because it was temporary, because he would eventually be able to discard it completely once he figured out how to stay in the real world permanently, once he found the way to stop being pulled back into the simulation. In the dream, his body was strong and healthy, could lift Emma and play with her and do all the things a father should do, could work in the garden and teach his classes and live fully and completely without the constant exhaustion that plagued the waking body. That was the body that mattered, the body that was actually his, the body that felt like him when he inhabited it. The waking body was just something he borrowed temporarily, something that would eventually wear out and he would leave behind with no regrets. In August, he started having trouble waking up at all, started to find that the pull of the waking world was weaker, less insistent, easier to resist. He would drift up toward consciousness and feel the apartment trying to pull him in, trying to claim him, trying to drag him back into the simulation, and he would fight it, would cling to the dream, would focus on Claire's breathing next to him or the sound of Emma in her crib or the quality of morning light through the bedroom window, and sometimes he could push the waking world away and sink back down into the real world where his family was, where he belonged. But sometimes the apartment would win and he would find himself lying in bed staring at the ceiling that looked less real each time, that looked flat and fake like it was painted on cardboard, like it was a stage prop rather than an actual ceiling. And he would lie there for minutes or hours just waiting to be allowed back to where he belonged, counting the minutes until he could sleep again, until he could close his eyes and return to reality. One night in early September he was putting Emma to bed, reading her a story about a dragon who was afraid of his own fire, a story she liked even though she was too young to understand it, just liked the sound of his voice and the rhythm of the words. Claire was standing in the doorway watching them with that look of contentment people get when they are exactly where they want to be with exactly who they want to be with, that look of pure presence and satisfaction. And he felt a tug, felt the familiar pull upward into waking, felt the apartment trying to drag him back, and he resisted it with everything he had. He focused on Emma's face, on her tiny features and the way her eyes were starting to close as she drifted toward sleep, on the weight of her in his lap, on the solid reality of her existence. He focused on Claire's presence in the doorway, on the love he saw in her expression, on the life they had built together. He focused on the feeling of the book in his hands, on the texture of the pages, on the words he was reading, on being present in this moment, on refusing to leave. And the pull got stronger and he held on tighter, refused to let go, refused to be dragged away from this moment, from this life, from these people who needed him and loved him and were real. For a while there was a kind of equilibrium, a balance between the two worlds pulling at him from different directions, and he was caught between them, stretched between two versions of reality, and then something shifted and the pull lessened and faded and he was still there, still reading to Emma, still in the house with his family, and he realized with a shock of relief that he had won, that he had managed to stay, that he didn't have to go back. The next morning in dream time he woke up next to Claire in their bed in their house and Emma was making noise in her crib in the nursery down the hall and he got up to get her, picked her up and held her and felt her small body against his chest, felt her trust in him, her absolute dependence on him, her love that didn't need to be earned or justified or explained. He took her downstairs to make breakfast, put her in her high chair and gave her pieces of banana to eat while he made coffee for himself and Claire. And the day unfolded the way days unfold when you have a young child, full of small moments and tasks and interactions, full of tiny dramas and challenges and joys. And at some point during that day he realized that he should have woken up in the apartment by now, that enough time had passed in dream time that he should have been pulled back to that other place. But he was still here, still in the real world, and the relief was overwhelming and absolute. He had somehow managed to stay, had broken through whatever barrier had been forcing him to split his time between two worlds, had figured out how to be present completely in the world that mattered, and now he was here fully, all of himself in one place, all of his consciousness and identity and being focused in this one reality. Days passed in dream time, then weeks, and he never woke up in the apartment, never felt the pull of that other world trying to claim him. He was just James now, fully and completely, living his life with Claire and Emma, teaching his classes at the college, seeing his friends, existing entirely and permanently in the world where he belonged. He could barely remember the apartment when he tried, could barely remember being Noah. It all seemed like a strange, distant dream he had once had, something that had felt real at the time but now seemed obviously false, obviously wrong, obviously not the truth of who he was. This was the real world, this life with weight and consequence and continuity, this life where his choices mattered and his presence made a difference and his relationships were deep and meaningful. This was where he was supposed to be, and he had almost lost it by spending so much time in that other place. That hollow simulation that had tried to convince him it was real even though it was nothing, was just a mistake, just a wrong turn he had taken that he had now corrected. But sometimes late at night after Claire and Emma were asleep, when the house was quiet and still and he lay awake in the darkness, he would feel a strange unease he couldn't quite name, couldn't quite articulate or understand. There was a version of his mother he couldn't remember, a face that should mean something but didn't, a relationship that should exist but was absent from his memory. There were memories that felt like they belonged to someone else, memories of an apartment and a job that had no meaning and days that repeated without variation. Memories that felt thin and unreal and wrong but also somehow familiar, somehow like they had actually happened to him even though he knew they hadn't, knew they couldn't have because this was his only life, his real life. And sometimes, very rarely, when he was falling asleep at night in the bed next to Claire, he would have the sensation of waking up, of surfacing into somewhere else, somewhere thin and cold and hollow, somewhere wrong. And in those moments he would feel a moment of terrible clarity, a moment of understanding that he had gotten everything backwards, that he had mistaken the dream for reality and reality for dream, that he had trapped himself on the wrong side of consciousness and that somewhere in a different world a body was lying in an apartment slowly dying because it wouldn't wake up, because the person inside it had decided that the real world wasn't worth living in, had chosen the comfort of a perfect dream over the difficulty of existence. But those moments would pass quickly, would be swallowed by sleep or by Emma crying or by Claire rolling over and putting her arm around him. And he would remember that this was the real world. This was where he belonged. This was the life he had chosen, and everything else was just a dream, just a strange nightmare about being someone named Noah who lived alone and worked a meaningless job and whose whole existence felt like moving through fog, like walking through a photograph of life rather than actually living. That person hadn't been real, had just been a role he had played temporarily, a mistake he had made that he had now corrected, and now he was free of it, now he was himself completely. Now he was James who had a wife and a daughter and a purpose, and that was enough, that was everything, that was all there was and all there needed to be. Months passed and then years in dream time. Emma grew and learned to walk and talk and became a person with her own personality and preferences and opinions. He and Claire talked about having another child and decided to try, and 9 months later they had a son they named Henry, and the family expanded and became more complex and more rich and more full. Life continued the way life continues, with ups and downs and challenges and joys and all the ordinary extraordinary moments that make up a human life, and he was present for all of it, was engaged and committed and real. And the memories of the apartment faded until they were nothing, until they were less than nothing, until they were just a vague sense that once, in a different version of reality that probably never existed at all, he had been someone else who lived a different life, but that version didn't matter anymore because this was the version that was real, this was the life that counted, this was the world where he existed and mattered and belonged. But somewhere, in a space that was not quite space and a time that was not quite time, a body lay in an apartment it had stopped being able to leave, and that body was getting thinner and weaker because it had not eaten in weeks, had not done anything except lie in bed and breathe and occasionally drink water from the sink in a kind of automatic movement that required no conscious thought, no will, no presence. The body's name was Noah, and it had once contained a person who had lived a life, but that person had left, had found somewhere else to be, somewhere that felt more real and more important, and the body was just the discarded shell, the thing that got left behind when consciousness made its choice, when identity chose the dream over the reality. On a Tuesday morning in November, exactly 1 year after Noah had first noticed the world feeling thin, someone from his apartment building came to check on him because other tenants had complained about a smell coming from his unit. A smell that suggested something was very wrong. They knocked on the door and got no answer, and eventually the building manager came with a master key and opened the door, and they found him in the bedroom lying on his back in the bed with his eyes closed and his hands folded on his chest. And at first they thought he might be asleep, but he was too still, too quiet, had been too still and too quiet for several days at least, possibly longer. The paramedics came and confirmed what everyone already knew, that Noah had died, probably of dehydration and malnutrition, that he had simply stopped taking care of himself and slowly faded away over a period of weeks or months. There would be an investigation and a report and eventually a quiet funeral that almost no one attended because Noah hadn't really known anyone, hadn't had any close connections or relationships that would make people mourn his passing, had been fundamentally alone in his life in a way that made his death feel inevitable, like the natural conclusion to a story about isolation and disconnection. But in the moments before the building manager opened the door, in the space between the knock and the key turning in the lock, James was sitting at the kitchen table in his house with Claire and Emma and Henry having breakfast on a Saturday morning, and Emma was telling him about something that happened at school, and Henry was making a mess with his cereal, and Claire was laughing and pouring more coffee, and the morning sunlight was coming through the window in a way that made everything warm and golden and perfect. And he felt happy, felt complete, felt real, felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, living the life he was meant to live, and he had no idea that somewhere else a version of his body was being discovered by strangers.